Hi everyone, I'm Les,
And I'm Ashley.
and you're listening to Anthropotamus, where we explore some of your favorite anthropology topics.
Hi everyone, welcome to our latest episode of Anthropotamus. Today we're here with Dr. Sophia Balakian. We're going to be talking about her book, Unsettled Families. She is an assistant professor at George Mason University, whose research interests focus on migration, humanitarianism, and kinship. Thank you again, Sophia, for being on the show with us today.
Thank you.
Actually, before we get started, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what led you into your interest in migration humanitarianism?
Sure. Well, I suppose there's a longer story and a shorter story, but I was an anthropology major in college, and one of the things that initiated my interest in migration and refugees and displacement was an early undergraduate anthropology course. Um, in which one of the books that we read for that course was Lisa Mulkey's book Purity and Exile, which became a really important text on refugees in the field of anthropology and sort of an early work on refugees in the field. That book in particular helped me to reflect on my own background as an Armenian American and thinking about the ways in which my own family came to the United States, or parts of my family came to the United States in the 1920s, and what it meant for a community to sort of define itself around a history of mass violence and genocide. And so that was sort of that course helped me think about the ways in which I could think about these kinds of issues through the field of anthropology, and that sort of set me on a course.
So in your book, you started off by discussing, how we view families and kinship in the US or Western cultures versus in Africa, and how DNA is being implemented. Excuse me, how DNA is being implemented to ensure that families are being, I guess, truthful in our perspective, or I don't want to say our perspective, but Western perspectives, when trying to get refugee status. But you do mention there are linked cases where there's exceptions of, families being able to, claim their nieces and such.
Mhm.
How how common is it for people to actually be able
Mhm.
to get these linked cases, and what are
Mhm.
the obstacles they have to face to actually be able to keep their families together?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So as you know noted, in our US under US refugee policy, currently DNA testing is employed specifically in reunification cases when one family member has come to the US and is now applying to sponsor their family. And that family has to consist of a spouse and or biological children under the age of 21 who are unmarried. And so DNA testing is employed to ensure that that definition is being met. And in cases where a family is all together and resettling together, DNA testing isn't typically used, but a sort of nuclear family model is the norm. Um, But as you noted, sometimes a kind of linked or cross-referenced case can be used. And I'll just give sort of two examples that help to explain how that might be used and when it might not be used. But I guess I would say one of the general obstacles is that it's sort of at the discretion of the staff member that's overseeing the case. So one pretty common example in which it would be likely to be used is so refugee resettlement cases typically take many, many years to go through a system from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or a sort of adjacent non-governmental organization, and then into some governmental, whether it be the US or Canada, the UK, et cetera, system. So in the course of those many years, often dependents on a case, children in a case will age out. So you might have a case where, you have a single mom and their 5 kids, and now by the time that case has gotten ready to depart, 2 of the kids are over the age of 21. So it would be pretty common for those 2 kids to now they're not able to be on that case, but they are able to be on their own linked case. So that would be typical. So I want to now give you an example in which it would be more common for a linked case not to be created. So I think of a family I knew while conducting research in Nairobi, where you have a husband and wife and their 3 young children. And there's a young woman from their community who's been separated from her family. She's over 21. She's not married. She meets this family at church, and this is a family from the eastern part of Congo. And she's in a very precarious situation economically and otherwise. And so through the friendship she has with this family, she comes to be part of their household. Um, and lives with the family as part of the family economically, socially, and so forth. When this family's case comes up for resettlement, the UN staff member overseeing the case says, this woman is not part of your family. She's not part of your family biologically. She's over 21, so she's not a dependent, and she won't be included on your case, and we're not seeing her as eligible for her own case. So that would be a case in which both because of the fact that she's not a biological relative, she's not considered a dependent because she's not a minor, she would be excluded. So I think, largely it's to the discretion of the staff member overseeing, who's determining, is this person truly a member of the family in our view? And so it sort of speaks to the fact that there's always this kind of bureaucratic sorting going on in which determinations are being made about sort of who counts and who doesn't.
So I wanted to ask kind of a linked question on that, just because you mentioned in that first case there uh, that sometimes children will age out of that, and later in the book you go into pretty good detail about the humanitarian aspect of it and how focused they are on the truth and what that
Mhm.
means.
Sure.
How often did you meet individuals who would lie about their age or
Mhm.
predict it in the future and lie about their age so that they would avoid aging out?
Yeah. So I can't really, I guess what I would say is that people that I spoke to who did this work in the humanitarian space in UN, and also people who sort of were sort of contracted by the US State Department, said that, in past years, and I think starting after 9/11, there was a real sort of ramping up of the securitization of refugee resettlement. But I think there was a sense that, like, for example, in the 90s in particular, it was very common for people to try to present their families or reformulate their families in such a way that they thought it would be most likely that they would be able to stay together. Um, And I think that sort of documentation practices in more recent years have made that more, have made that less possible. So, having more sort of securitized identification documents that chart people's dates of birth and requiring certain kinds of, birth certificates and things like that. So I think it's probably less common now.
What do you think about the how it almost seems humanitarian efforts have become almost militarized in a lot of ways? And what are your thoughts on the disparity between humanitarianism as an occupation versus, well, I mean, what the definition is supposed to be?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think there's a lot of good scholarship that shows that, you know, humanitarian work has often facilitated military operations or been connected to military operations. Um, I think that in my own work, what I have been most interested in is the ways in which um, humanitarian work and immigration bureaucracies and immigration policies that have sort of national securitization at their heart are really interlinked. I think that in refugee resettlement, because sort of um, the UN and sort of adjacent NGOs are sort of are inextricably linked to and collaborating with government immigration systems. Those things are sort of inseparable in the way that refugee resettlement works and is administered. And so um, humanitarian efforts become, in this case in particular, in refugee resettlement in particular, um, I often use the term sort of securitized humanitarianism, and I think we can think about that in a military sense. And in my work, I think about it more in the sense of sort of securitized immigration policy.
All right. Yeah. And thank you for that answer. I know that was a kind of a difficult, it was a messy question. I guess the next thought that I had on that subject was about uh, I forget which chapter then it was, but it was
Sure. Yeah.
it may have been Broken Bone Unhealed, if
Hmm.
that's the right name.
Hmm.
But it was about the young young men who were attempting to um, secure a spot to go to the US or Canada or
Hmm.
Australia, whichever they were going to, but they were trying to get out of the country in question. And the main thought on that was that if you could make it to the office, you weren't in the most need of help.
Sure. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah. So and this is more of a comment than a question, but it seems like a bit of an oxymoron, right? As a humanitarian whose job is to help ease the suffering of other humans, uh, with a stationary operation area, how do you expect the people that you're supposed to help to get to you if you're not going to help the people that get to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and it's a kind of uh, peculiar a peculiar binary that comes up in the sort of humanitarian logics, and that comes up in the humanitarian logic, certainly in the Kenyan and broader East African context. I suspect it exists elsewhere as well, but it's this what I would call a false dichotomy between the assertive and the vulnerable. So the idea that if you can assert yourself, if you can actively work toward resettlement, you're not the people that the organizations want to resettle. So there's this, there's this sense that, I mean, part of this is rooted in a sort of fact of the numbers, which is that when you combine all of the countries that have refugee resettlement programs and all of the available, all of the slots that are made available by those countries each year in their respective immigration programs, fewer than 1% of refugees worldwide will be resettled. And so I think what that has created in refugee resettlement work in places like Kenya, where I have done my research, is a a need to justify exclusion. So a need to find ways of a sort of it's a requirement of the work to say, well, we are resettling, the term that's often used is the most vulnerable, and we need to find only those who are, the most needy and the most vulnerable. And to accept that in reality, only 1% of people living outside of citizenship rights, often incarcerated really in refugee camps, that only 1% of them actually merit or deserve resettlement is a really false idea. But it's one that I think humanitarian work has sort of tacitly accepted, and therefore the search for the truly deserving has become a big part of how that work is conducted. And um, so it's a really perplexing logic, and I think it really is an outgrowth of um, a humanitarian imperative to help the most, does the sort of the humanitarian imperative to help the most needy, but also in the context of a vast scarcity or a vast uh, lack of options for many, many people who should not live in refugee camps for generations, who should not be without basic rights afforded by citizenship.
So I guess I'll ask one more question, and again, this is another one that might be a little messy. Before I let Ashley ask her next question here, but um, one thing that I've noticed a lot in my reading, not just this book, but in many others, is, and even just in daily life, is that bureaucracy tends to breed contempt. Um, did you feel that the humanitarians in this situation sort of started to use the us and them mentality, just to justify their work, if for no other reason than their own mental health?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I I think that people working in these kinds of settings often do sort of create distancing mechanisms, ways to put distance between themselves and people in need who are often requesting their help and assistance, who in fact, they often don't have the means to support, or certainly don't have the means to support the majority of people who are requesting their help. Um, so yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that bureaucracy and bureaucratic systems, I'm teaching this week. A book about childcare and reading about women who are, dealing with the welfare system and childcare subsidies being accused of fraud by those systems. And I'm thinking, gosh, this sounds really familiar. So I think there are certain patterns we see in, bureaucratic systems, but also systems that are welfare systems or welfare-like systems, aid systems that often position those who are seeking their assistance, who often are always doubting those who are seeking their assistance. Do you really qualify, that sort of question?
I think it's also important to note that the people in these humanitarian positions are in a position that is extremely difficult for them. While it's not, it's not the same as living in a refugee camp. It's not the same as going through the trauma that they've been through. You're in a position of authority with very, very little power to do any real good for the mass. I can imagine that would have to take a very heavy toll on the person's mental health, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, that the sort of the the position of people doing that kind of work and um, people living as refugees about their experiences day in and day out. People were not sort of the primary uh, subject of my own analysis, although I do talk to those people and some of those people, but I don't sort of study them in a sort of systematic ethnographic way. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that these are not easy positions to be in, and um, to be able to truly keep sight of the humanity of the people you're working with is something that I think those people in those roles would have to sort of um, be very intentional about. Um, and certainly both both at in all the spaces I interviewed people at UNHCR, folks contracted by the State Department, at an NGO that I write about in the book. I think a lot of people were, come to the work with a really sincere interest in helping people, but also find themselves in a system that is really, really complicated.
So I was curious, you do mention that the organization prefers to process families rather than individuals because it's less paperwork. I was curious, how common is it that individuals get refugee status?
Mhm.
And knowing that it is more difficult for individuals versus families to get that status, is it more common for individuals to look for other ways to
Hmm.
migrate
I
out?
agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, so it wouldn't be more difficult for them to get refugee status, but to get resettlement. That's right. And I think um, one thing that I'm trying to communicate in the book is that while in the field of refugee studies, there's often been a sort of critical analysis of the fact that refugee status is given on the basis of sort of individual claims. In fact, resettlement has largely been organized through family units. And, you mentioned the point I make that organizations often prefer to resettle large families because it's less work to resettle more people. But it's not only the sort of administrative piece, it's also the kind of humanitarian, moral imperative to help families. So sort of the family as an object of humanitarian care. Um, but yeah, individuals sometimes are resettled. So individuals who exist, under some, particular humanitarian priority. Individuals certainly can be, and I can think of a couple of cases. Um, and sometimes individuals will also be resettled as part of those linked cases that, you asked about earlier on. Um, so, it might be that young man who's aged out of his family's case, or it might be, a caregiver in a family who's maybe a niece or a cousin who's taking care of a disabled child, who, is understood to be an integral part of the functioning of this family, and who would be given a linked case. So sometimes individuals sort of resettle in that way, but it is still sort of tied to this idea of, or tied to their role in a family's case. Um, and I guess I wanted to note about um, about those linked cases can also be given have different final determinations. And in one case that I write about, in which two young men who are over 21 by the time their family's case is being processed, their case moves forward, and their mother and their younger siblings are actually denied. So those linked cases, sort of back to that question of how that can help facilitate family unity or not. Sometimes it ends up not actually working in the end.
You do have a section talking about camp stories, people making up stories to try to make themselves seem more vulnerable, when in reality the truth may actually be more helpful and
Mhm.
instead. I mean, can you explain to the listeners how this
Mhm.
actually hurts the most vulnerable rather than helps?
Yeah, well, so the sort of camp story is a term that people who were working in refugee resettlement sometimes use to describe a story that was known to be effective, and therefore they started to hear over and over again. And so I think of this idea of the camp story as really an outgrowth of a system that, again, is, very opaque, where people have a very, very limited understanding of how the system works, and have um, very low levels of trust that they will be heard and understood. So I think that people sort of are weighing their options. Do I tell a story that I know has been effective for people in the past, that I know has been deemed legit, credible and legitimate? Um, or do I risk telling my real story and having it be not believed, or having it be deemed not sort of not bad enough to sort of get me through to the next stage of this process. So I think that what I heard in among people who worked in the refugee resettlement world was that you know I think often there was the idea that well, if you tell this sort of stock story, um, actually you're sort of undermining your own eligibility. And so it has this sort of fraught and these sort of fraught and complicated outcomes where maybe sometimes the camp story works for a while, or it works when if you get the right interviewer, but other times a person who may have all kinds of vulnerabilities that might qualify them, so to speak, for resettlement, might tell a story that ultimately ends up being, um, disqualifying them, so to speak. So I think it's what's interesting about the idea of the camp story is that, for me anyway, it's a reflection of a system in which people have learned that telling the truth about their lived experiences is not necessarily going to help them escape um, a situation that they are desperate to get out of.
Seems like the people conducting these interviews value novelty more than the actual story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I think that there's this, at the end of the day, a, a majority of people who are hoping to be resettled are not going to get a resettlement case, or they're not going to make it through to the end of this process. And so, um, I think there's a level of kind of arbitrariness to, who gets selected and who doesn't at some level. But I do think that there's this balance that has to be struck between sort of novelty, as you said, like something unique, something that sounds like, it really happened to the individual, but also something that sort of fits with that they talk about sort of consistency and credibility. Um, and so it has to be credible in the sense that it fits known facts about what has transpired in a certain area during a certain time. And therefore, you also would expect there to be some significant degree of similarity across what people are saying they experienced. If they came from a certain place in a certain time where certain events were, going on. So I think it's a sort of balance that has to be struck, that it doesn't sound like a sort of stock camp story, but on the other hand, it doesn't deviate so much from what is sort of publicly known to be true.
Kind of a tightrope walk there if you look at it really. I mean,
Yeah.
because the consequences of this are like deadly serious.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
trying to balance truth, novelty, and the real, very real danger that these people are in a lot of the times.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, they're very well incentivized to lie a lot of the time because the consequence could be that they either lose their livelihood, they lose their ability to work, or they lose their life, or they lose a loved one.
Sure. Yes, yes, yes. And or often that they're stuck in very, very difficult circumstances where they, have no right to work or to, have a sort of basic security. Um, yeah, I would say that um, the scarcity of opportunities, the high stakes of these situations, and the lack of trust in the institutions and uh, lack of transparency leads to situations in which there's a lot of difficult decisions that people have to make without having really adequate information. Um, yeah.
I was curious, if only, only 1% get resettled.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm assuming people know this, that, you know, very slim chance they're going to get to um, be resettled. I mean, are they putting all their eggs in one basket, or are they also
Mm.
looking at other opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I forgot to answer the part of your other question about single people, going other routes. Um, so sometimes resettlement is the only basket for some folks. Uh, Sort of going through North Africa and going to Europe using smugglers is another route that is known to be both very dangerous and expensive, so requires some, resources up front that people might be able to access through relatives sending money from abroad. Um, potentially folks who have already gone through the resettlement program and are living in Europe or in North America. Um, so there aren't there there I think depending on people's socioeconomic position, often in relation to, having family that might be sending money from abroad, um, resettlement might be the only option for migration, for onward migration. For others, I would say, in terms of onward migration, that there are folks who may be thinking about going via smugglers. Um, there were some sort of educational programs, like um, for some young high school educated Somalis living in Nairobi, for example. Some found sort of higher ed opportunities in countries abroad, like Turkey, for example, but that would be, for a very small minority. Um, some might be looking at not only sort of direct resettlement, but do I have a relative in a country that can sponsor me in some way? So, Canada, for example, has a somewhat more expansive sponsorship, has more is less focused on nuclear family relations. So you could sponsor a nephew, for example. Um, But, then, there are all these other baskets, and I'm not sure if you meant just in relation to onward migration, but people might be thinking about doing other things. How am I going to make a life? Am I going to leave this refugee camp and go to Nairobi and open a business, for example? Am I going to return? Am I going back to Somalia and, to try to pursue X or Y? So I think it varies a lot by person, but one thing I would say, certainly in some communities that I spent time with in Nairobi is that the lack of, or sort of the narrowness of those opportunities um, doesn't really match the outsized role of resettlement um, in people's imaginations. So I think that resettlement, um, and there are others who have written about this, Cindy Horst, for example, um, resettlement plays this sort of outsized role in people's dreams about the future because it offers something that is so perceived as so much dramatically better than what people are experiencing in a refugee camp, for example, and um, that doesn't necessarily the dream of resettlement doesn't necessarily um, match the reality of resettlement, but certainly there's a great deal of hope put into that possible future.
I did want to clarify something because I'm not sure if I
Sure,
read this correctly.
sure.
You mentioned the text messaging to some individuals for resettlement
Mm,
counseling.
mm.
Um, is it typical for individuals to have their cases denied when they are summoned to the counseling? Or
What would be more common would be that they would be told, I'm sorry, what you're telling me is not a story worthy of resettlement. So it wouldn't necessarily be that the case would be denied there. It would be more that it would be a person who wouldn't have a case and who went to UNHCR with the hope that they would explain a story that would get them a resettlement case. And instead, they would be told, you know, um, I'm sorry, what you're telling me is just like everybody else. It's not something unique. It's not something special. It doesn't make you particularly vulnerable. And so you should go to refugee camp. This would be in the context of the capital city. You should go to the refugee camp where you can get food aid or, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be, someone going with the hope that they would be recognized as someone who could have a resettlement case and then being told, excuse me.
at that
And
point, would they have the opportunity to like, I don't know, what try again, or is that just like it for them?
Yeah, no, I think there's always this persistent hope that okay, well that staff member said no, but maybe I'm going to figure out how to tell my story a different way. And maybe next time I'm going to meet a different staff member who's more sympathetic to me. And yeah, I think that would probably it would probably not be likely that would um, dissuade someone from ever returning. And I think because historically, and have written about this, historically there has been corruption within UNHCR, and that's something that's known to people living as refugees, corruption in UNHCR in Kenya at least. Um, I, I think that that many people have a sense that if I can that the rules are not so cut and dry, that just because one person told me this doesn't mean that someone else might not tell me something else.
So I've heard things like that called social hacking.
Mm,
And it's like there's obviously the social contract between people, and then there's the actual contracts between a person and an organization, and there's always a line that can be, fudged here or smeared there. And I part of the reason I bring this up is because there was a portion, I think the chapter was called buying cases or something like that.
mhm.
Yeah, that where you were talking about the corruption in the resettlement process. And how many restrictions they put in place to help stop that.
Hmm.
But I wonder how effective those are. Like when you put a rule in place, how long does it take for somebody to find a way around it?
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I guess what I would like to say is that in that chapter, what I'm trying to point out is that um, uh, refugees are often accused by people working in the sort of securitized humanitarian space, this intersection of immigration bureaucracy or immigration um, uh, world of immigration policy and sort of humanitarian resettlement work. Refugees are often accused of so-called fraud, which I try to complicate throughout this book. But what I try to also point out in that chapter is that um, refugees, people living as refugees themselves, really point their finger back at the organizations, and note that there have been unfair practices and sometimes illicit practices within those organizations. And I think that's an important sort of counter to the ways in which people who live as refugees and are documented as refugees are often positioned by those same organizations as sort of cheating the system or not being truthful and so forth.
Uh, so you briefly touched on at the end of the book, Muhammad's transition to a life in Canada.
Mhm.
I think you might have briefly mentioned this in the beginning when we started the interview, and then it's also in your bio discussing your research on how individuals or families navigate around US policies or
Mhm.
Canadian policies
Mhm.
and such. But could you discuss a little bit about the obstacles and struggle refugees have to face once they actually do move over and become settled?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, so after I left sort of my long-term research in Nairobi, I came to Columbus, Ohio, which is a city that has the second largest Somali community in the US and a large number of other refugee communities, a large number of Nepali Bhutanese, Iraqi, various East African refugee communities. And one of the things I was first struck by was that so many people who were recently arrived were waiting for people. So and sort of your questions have sort of brought this up throughout our conversation. Um, Often those, back to those linked cases, like people were waiting for the other part of their cross-referenced or linked case, or they were waiting for relatives or family members on a different case, or they were using the family reunification. They had come alone for whatever, various reasons and were waiting for the family reunification process for their children or their spouse or that of course creates a lot of emotional stress, and it also means, and this was sort of true across the board, especially in the Somali community that I spent probably the most time with in Columbus, um, that people were sending whatever money they had or as much money as they could back to a refugee camp, to relatives in Somalia. So there was a very, very strong expectation that once they were in the United States, they um, they would be supporting people elsewhere. Um, so, you know, I would say the combination of the sort of emotional rupture of being separated from family members, the expectation that they be supporting family members, you know, in combination with the fact that they were often first looking for jobs, working low wage jobs, often long hours for, you know, minimal income. And then, of course, just navigating the complexity of being in a completely new society, language learning, driving, transportation, of course, finding, you know, finding work, often greater social isolation. And so, you know, those were certainly some of the primary challenges.
With with you know Trump's administration paused on refugee admissions recently, how does that impact those whose applications have been approved and were ready to
Hmm.
settle?
Yeah, so my understanding is that it's a total, you know, halt. So nobody is getting on planes. So that means that people who have been through, you know, often many years of waiting, and not just waiting, but work, of following up with organizations, of interviewing, of you know, procuring necessary documents, of all of the labor and expenditure of resources, of spending their own, you know, money to get to organizational offices, to get to embassies, to get to various interviews and appointments. Um, so all of that is, you know, on hold. And that's also true for people being sponsored through the Refugee Family Reunification Program. So that means that, you know, parents who have been waiting for their children, or people who've been waiting for a spouse for many years, and who expected that those people to come, are sort of in again in this sort of liminal space, not knowing when this might be resolved.
Does this mean that once refugees are allowed to enter again, that they just move forward, or would they have to start another process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't say for sure because I don't know how the program may be reconfigured, or what will happen in the future. But I think at the very least, they will probably have to undergo certain kinds of security clearances again, other kinds of a lot of these clearances and background checks, and even health clearances, have a certain, you know, expiration date. So maybe something is good for a year or 18 months. So by the time this program is reinstated, and of course we don't know when it will be, there may be new regulations that they have to now undergo. But it's also, you know, likely that things like their medical clearances will have expired and they'll have to redo those. So it will certainly set people back, I would imagine, you know, significantly.
So now that this book is published, what are you working on now?
Oh, so so I'm still finishing up a little bit of writing that comes out of this research. So I'm finishing a couple of articles. Um, One that is focused on the memorial of a massacre that took place in a UN-run refugee camp in Burundi. And I'm thinking about memorialization and sort of resistance through memorialization. And another article actually is sort of connected to something I just mentioned, thinking about resettlement actually as a form of work that refugees themselves perform. So we often, think about refugee resettlement as a kind of, and it's often built into the language that organizations use, that this is, that people are being rescued, that they're sort of passive objects of rescue. And unless this kind of connects to your question about the kind of the assertive and the vulnerable as well, but in fact, waiting for resettlement requires a lot of work on the part of people who are seeking to be resettled. And so that's something I've been writing about. And then I'm in the very, very early stages of a project that is trying to think through what care work looks like for people who are coming from East African contexts and living now in a very different social, economic, and political context in the United States.
Thank you again for being on the show with us. Can you tell our listeners where they can find your book?
Yes, so my book is available through Stanford University Press site, or really anywhere else books are sold.
Once again, we were discussing her book, Unsettled Families. So check it out. Very interesting, easy read. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
For those watching us on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, bye. Thank you all for listening. Distribution of Anthropotamus is in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Please continue to follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Anthropotamus for our latest episodes, show notes, and book discussion schedule.